Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is another episode of Anatolian Dispatch, part of the Ahval News podcast family. Today we have with us again Colonel Chris Kilford, retired. Dr. Chris Kilford is his other title. He has a PhD in history and brings that great historical understanding to his analysis of all things Turkish, which is what we do here at Anatolian Dispatch. So Chris, this week we just finished with the G7 meeting, of which Turkey was not a part, but also the NATO summit, in which Erdoğan participated. So maybe let's start with anything you'd like to say about the G7 and its communique and what, if any, impact that has on Turkey, but then move kind of quickly into your readout of what happened at the NATO summit that's kind of important for Turkey, if anything.
Well, I thought, first of all, it was nice to see that we had President Biden there. I think everybody around the table was breathing a little easier, let's say, compared to the last meeting that took place. And it was good to see people working together and focused on what the issues are, whether it's Russia or China. Obviously, now China is being used as a raison d'etre in part for NATO. And then the question of Afghanistan, which really puts Turkey front and center because there has been speculation, discussion that Turkey would take over command of the, well, they do some of the security now, but actually run the airport as NATO forces and American forces not attached to NATO depart, which is fine. I spent a year in Afghanistan myself and flew in and out of that Kabul airport many times, and we had a military presence of our own there. But this is quite an interesting thing for Turkey, because we know the Taliban has said, well, we're not that interested in having you there. But it will come down to the fact that whoever's in power in Afghanistan in the future would want to have an airport, I would think, up and running. And so the question will be, will the airport be out of bounds to any combat conflict and so forth? I don't know how you can actually make that work. And I don't think Turkey will be prepared to stay around if things deteriorate, no matter how long that connection with Afghanistan has been. I mean, 100 years ago, there were Turkish military advisors in Afghanistan. It's a long relationship, but I'm not sure how long, if Turkey will be able to pull this off, even with some help. So this will be interesting, but it's clear that Turkey, from a NATO standpoint, is still front and center on the agenda and an integral part of the organization.
Yeah. I mean, there had been speculation that Turkey was going to try to leverage continued security at the airport to get the U.S. to back away on S-400s. And I read those as the lead up to the meeting between Erdoğan and Biden and said, no. I mean, what? Yeah. Was that ever really? I can't imagine that was seriously considered by anyone, that somehow Turkey would leverage its commitment to the Kabul airport to get the U.S. to back down on S-400s. I mean, they're so disjointed. I don't know how anybody could actually write that stuff.
I'm sure if you were in the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there would be a whiteboard up on the wall, and you would have your marker, and you would be trying to sketch out as many potential options that you can think of. It wouldn't surprise me at all if something like that was on the table, along with 100 other things. But the fact is that none of them really will have any effect on this whole issue of the fact that Turkey owns the S-400s and no one now knows what to do with them, and so. Obviously everybody looks for an angle, and if you were Turkish, you would be doing that. I wouldn't be surprised if that might have at one point percolated up as an option, but wouldn't have seen, realistically the light of day as something that you would offer.
Yeah,
the United States would just shake their heads about this. The writing's on the wall for Afghanistan. My view is that it's going to deteriorate there very, very, very quickly. already I have personal friends who've been in and out of Afghanistan for 20 years, and they tell me in emails how desperate people now are on the ground about what the future will bring. So yeah, we will watch this. I keep telling my friends up here that we need to be prepared to accept a wave of Afghan refugees, very similar to the somewhat 70,000 Syrian refugees we've taken in.
Yeah. Well, and there's been a lot of press coverage in the United States about how little and how slowly the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Department of Defense are doing for those Afghans who have worked closely with American forces, whether as interpreters, as guides, as drivers. I mean, I know from my experience in Iraq, we had to be very, very careful about protecting any Iraqi who, worked for the Americans. And it was, for many of them, if they had been known, it would be a death sentence. And that's why we had this thing called the Special Immigrant Visa Program, which was open to basically any Iraqi who had and could document. And then, that, of course, was the responsibility of the embassy or the military to show that this individual had worked closely with the U.S. and therefore merited this special immigrant visa status. And quite frankly, there's been a number of press accounts in the U.S. about how everybody's dragging their feet on this. And there's a lot of concern because it's clear that the people who are writing these stories are writing them because they're hearing that the situation is going to, if not collapse in September, it's going to deteriorate so quickly that anyone who's left behind who has an association with the U.S. had better get out quickly.
Yeah, last month we saw the Australian embassy close, and I keep watching to see other embassies closing, and including the Canadian embassy, and what will happen with the U.S. embassy. There's a lot of discussion about U.S. assets being on call as needed, and of course various other, agencies being on call if the Afghans need that kind of support. But it's the optics. I mean, NATO is leaving and America is leaving, and you can leave behind what you want, but and talk about it. But the fact is, the overall optics are that you are leaving, and Afghans are on their own. And you're absolutely right. Anybody working at those embassies in any capacity is very fearful for their life. There's just no question about it. We often don't get that over here. We think, well, they'll just blend back into society, but that's not going to happen. No.
Well, since that gets us onto the NATO, U.S., Turkey engagement, and we'll see. I agree with you. I think Turkey, they would like to continue to play a role in Afghanistan, but they're not going to sacrifice their people just so they can say that they're engaged.
Well, no, exactly right. And look, I mean, Turkey's played their cards very close when it comes to Afghanistan. They were located at Camp Warehouse. They generally kept to themselves. They wouldn't engage in any sort of combat. They made sure that they stayed out of the thick of things, if you like. I stand to be corrected, but I think the only casualties that they suffered during their entire time there was, I think a lieutenant colonel and a driver were killed in a car accident.
There was a helicopter crash too.
Yeah, so but in terms of combat, I mean, I'd be honest with the viewers here, I'd have to go and look this up, but I recall that casualties have been very light because they kept themselves away from this for good reason.
What we haven't been able to tease out is whether the Taliban thought it was in their own interest to not go after the Turks. No one knows. It's an interesting speculation, because if that were the case, if the Turks were seen as, fellow Muslims who are here fulfilling an obligation, but they haven't really been fighting us, and it has to go into the mix of trying to figure out, could the Turks actually stay to maintain the security of Kabul airport?
Yeah.
You know,
That
and as you
relationship.
said, one would expect the Taliban, whoever's governing the country, to want to have an international airport that was secure and useful for bringing in
Yeah.
commerce. One would expect that. But let's move on to you know, the kind of in a sense the big news, the much ballyhooed news that Erdogan and Biden had a meeting after and then there was a nice little interesting press readout by Biden. So what's your take on Erdogan and Biden and that meeting they had?
So the first thing I have to say is that a lot of the commentary that I've been looking at has said that the two met for 45 minutes, which is fine. That's true. But you and I have both been in the room when these meetings take place, and everybody seems to have forgotten that there was translation involved. So really, it's a 20-minute meeting, if you like, at best, 20 minutes. And in that 20 minutes, there's an awful lot that has to be said. And if anybody has watched President Erdoğan speak at conferences, he will go on and press his point. And so I would imagine, although President Biden is no pushover by any means, that he would have been listening carefully as President Erdoğan went on about all of the issues that they have with the United States, for example, support with the US supporting the YPG and the reasons why Turkey disagrees with this and all the other things that your viewers know well. So I would imagine that this 20 to 25-minute meeting at best was a lot of one way with Turkey pushing its point of view and President Biden listening, but of course, very well prepared that he was going to be listening to all of this. And everybody leaves the room and nice things are said afterwards. Why I think it was, well, first of all, not a lot came out of this, and all of the disagreements that we know will continue, but it was incredibly important for the Turkish side. And this is why President Biden, in my view, was holding all the cards. He didn't have to really do anything. It was essential, though, for the Turks that that a press release is put out afterwards saying that you know, relations are good and we had a fruitful discussion and all of that, simply because anything else would have affected the economy, the lira, which was bouncing around up and down based on day-to-day discussions. Right. And it's already trending towards 9 to the US dollar and potentially getting worse. And we know at the central bank, we've seen a revolving door. And so for all of these reasons, it was important that that meeting come off as you know, a reasonably good outcome at the end of the day, but nothing was resolved, as you know.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the point about, 45 minutes with translation is 20 to 25 minutes. That is a key thing. Look, I think Joe Biden went in there to establish kind of a basic working relationship with President Erdogan. Unlike his predecessor, he's not trying to establish personality-driven relationships with other heads of state. Joe Biden has a long history in foreign relations in the United States. And, you know, in a sense, he approaches things in a much more traditional and professional way. Usually there are exceptions to it, as we saw when he was in Ukraine, basically insisting that the Ukrainians fire someone or they weren't going to get their money. You can do that when you have the leverage and the other side is in no position. But I don't think that was his goal here. His goal here was to treat Erdogan with respect, allow him to make his case, as you just said, knew full well that Erdogan was then going to come out of the meeting and say things went well, it was fruitful discussion, a pleasure to talk to Biden, blah, 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 all that stuff, in part because of the markets. The economy is watching carefully what was going to happen. And then what people are not paying attention to is that after that 45-minute tete-a-tete, there was at least another 30 minutes, which may not have been conducted with translation. I'm not sure. I haven't been able to find out. That included the defense ministers and the foreign ministers U.S. Secretary of State and Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu. I think the interesting thing about that is that's where I think the work really starts happening. These issues haven't been resolved. They weren't going to be resolved in this one-on-one. But now they get, you're going to have bilateral commissions or working groups or whatever. I'm pretty sure Hulusi, yes, I know this, that Akar knows Lloyd Austin from before. They at least know each other. And so, they can expand on that. It's going to remain contentious, right? I mean, the S-400 issue is not going to just poof, go away. But I think in some ways it was a good start. And, it's going to be a working relationship. It's going to be a professional relationship. Again, unlike his predecessor, Biden is not going to be seeking some sort of personal connection with
yeah, but even then, Ed, I mean, it's going to be far more different with Biden, because I just can't see President Biden tweeting that the United States will, as Trump did, said, we'll destroy the Turkish economy if we don't get our way.
It's already instructive. One thing I've written about for Ahval about the Turkey-Biden relationship, the Erdoğan-Biden relationship, is that on the issues and the substance of the issues, that's not going to change. Regardless of who the president of the United States is, the S-400 is a problem. The S-400 issue is a problem. Regardless of who the president of the United States is, dealing with the Syrian Defense Forces, the YPG, it's going to be. What's going markedly different will be the tone. And you saw that, as you noted, in the G7. Nobody's walking around on eggshells waiting for the explosion of the latest tweet and the tweet storm and all this sort of stuff. And, to return to the Biden tweets, Biden does tweet, but you can be sure that he doesn't send anything out on it's the @POTUS, President of the United States tweet. That doesn't go out until it's been vetted by a number of people. That's first off, because again, his background. So, I mean, one of the things is, which was probably really useful for Erdogan's learning. He learned in his meeting with Biden, I think, that he's not, he can turn on the charm campaign, but the results will be radically different than they were with Biden's predecessor. Donald Trump, radically different personality. Erdogan's going to have to make serious adjustments in the way he deals with the new U.S. president.
Yeah, and it's very important, of course, because nothing has really changed if you're sitting in Ankara and you're the Turkish president.
Right.
When you look around domestically, your economy is in a bit of trouble. You've had a tough run through COVID, and all the neighbors are still there, and all of those issues haven't gone away. And you have to manage your way through this because you've got that eye on the 2023 election. So how you approach the United States is so important, and to have a calming presence in the White House, even though it's still as tough as it always was when dealing with Turkey. One of the things that I did, because I knew we were talking about these things, was I dug up Lyndon Johnson's letter to Ismet Inonu from 1964, and you can see how that that U.S.-Turkey relationship has always been a critical one. Yeah. But to have Biden there, I think, indeed for the entire region, to take a very calming view when it comes to the entire region, because we've had all of the issues between Israel and the Palestinians, and we still have troubles in Iraq, and we've got elections in Iran coming up, and and we will have elections coming up in Libya later on this year. So there's many things that need to, many things happening in that region, and having that calming presence in Washington, I think is really important.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I think it is really important. If we can just segue into something, you mentioned a little bit about issues that aren't going to go away in the S-400, but another issue which really much more involved, Canada is much more involved in it, is the development of the unmanned aerial vehicle industry of Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
As we've talked about before, Canada's Westcam was providing the I guess the surveillance module and the
Mm-hmm.
camera set in the front of the drones, the UAVs.
Mm-hmm.
There's been some recent writing about how the TB2, the Bayraktar TB2 UAV, is a quote unquote game changer. Could you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I before becoming a military attaché and doing many other things, I was an air defense officer working on the low-level air defense side, and had my fill of chasing around drones and whatnot. And they've been around for a while. I mean, it's not new technology. It's just that when they've been employed, as Turkey has been, selling them and offering them and using them, against sort of what I would call non-peer competitors, they can be really devastating when you don't have the means to fight back these drones or any air capability, fighter jets, helicopters, you name it. If you don't have something to counter it, you are in deep trouble. So the drones have added a layer onto these, the issue that many countries in the regions face who can't push back. Now, for the moment, things are going well. Drone sales are up. Poland's buying them. Ukraine's buying them from Turkey, and I'm sure there are many other customers in the region. But at the same time, the non-peer competitors, et cetera, will be really taking a hard look at the countermeasures that are available. They have been available, but people haven't really thought about it and invested them as much as they should. I mean, look, even here in Canada, we have no ground-based air defense. We got rid of my occupation several years ago because we thought, hey, it wasn't really necessary. But now I would imagine that countries are looking at jamming systems, counter drone systems, the Iron Dome equivalent against small UAVs. So certainly Israel's invested a lot into that. So we will see the countermeasures take place, but at the moment it's a real win for the Turks when it comes to their drone technology. They have spent a lot of time and money in this, and it's helping them in their fight against the PKK, and also with arms sales, and that's great, because when you look across the entire Turkish economy, there are sectors where you're just not doing well, but where you are doing very well is in arms sales. And you have seen the number of Turkish companies on the top 100 list of defense companies increase. It's at least 7 of the top 100 of companies now. Yeah. Their overall sales since 2003 have gone up and up and up, and they're building quality products. I think it's been really hard for them to break into the Western market, if you like, because I think a lot of Western countries still look at the Turkish arms industry as being second class. But they have made great progress, and I had an opportunity to tour many of their defense factories. My last visit was in 2014 with our Deputy Minister of Defense, and we went around and saw what was going on. In fact, we visited a number of places where companies that were building parts for the F-35, and Turkey was immensely proud of the contribution that they were making to the F-35 program. And of course, now that has all come to an end. But the overall industry is moving forward. I think the issue that they'll face, though, is there's only so much of this weaponry that the domestic market can use up. They're reaching, I think, potentially a saturation point. There's only so many things you can build for the Turkish military. So finding foreign customers becomes really, really important. And interestingly, as you do that, I mean, as you begin to sell your weapons to more and more countries, you'll find yourself in the same dilemma that countries like Canada and the United States and others have had, is when those countries are beginning to use those weapons that in ways that are against your interests, will you now be putting arms embargoes on them as you've had done to you? And I think this will be something
Well,
that the Turks will have to face.
well, as you know, both the United States and Canada have strict end user agreements
Yeah.
on all the stuff that we sell.
Mm.
There are countries, and I would imagine Turkey's one of them, that are not so strict in end user agreements, in part because Turkey has chafed under the end user agreements they had with the United States on all sorts of different things. And
Sure.
we don't need to go back to the Johnson letter. It's more recent information that there were efforts, and then of course the whole Westcam thing with the UAVs from Canada, so that was a component that was then embargoed because it had been used from the Canadian perspective improperly, blah, blah, blah. It is also of some concern that as the quality of the Turkish products, defense products increases, they might not have such a hard time exporting, because all they have to do is export them with, let's just say, loose end user agreements, and that'll make their product more attractive than something from the US or Canada or Great Britain that might have stricter end user agreements.
Yeah, as a responsible NATO country and all of this, they will have to be careful how they do this, because they are becoming a big player. And you could in the early days when you needed to make sales to get things rocking and rolling, you could perhaps play loosely with the rules, but they are a major player. I think at the moment they're like the 14th largest defense exporter in the world, and they'll want to have their products in the hands in the end of Western militaries more and more.
Right.
So I think we'll see how it plays out. I think where it's getting tough for them, though, is that countries like Canada still have quite wide sweeping arms embargoes on Turkey. They've had to push themselves domestically to come up with ways to get around this by building up their own capacities, like they always have, of course, in these situations. It's also getting more expensive for them to procure what they need for the weapon systems that they have, that yes, are domestically produced, but still require foreign components. And Ismail Demir was very, very clear on this in a talk he did recently, where he said, yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge, but we are still going to look for 100% of being able to do things up to 100% for those strategic components that we need. We understand that we'll still have to purchase stuff from overseas, of course, but in the critical pieces, we want to be 100% self-sufficient by 2023. And so it's a very ambitious goals. And we can shrug our shoulders and I guess and say, yeah, okay, but when you look at what the Turkish defense industry has done since 2003, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people who thought why they would think this. Not obviously they didn't follow closely, that the Turkish defense industry being pushed out of the F-35 program was going to be like a death knell, signaled the death knell for the Turkish defense industries. Quite to the contrary. I mean, they, from a purely business perspective, they ramped up investment into niches where they already had established some competency and reputation for quality to fill the gap. And given, if you look at since the pullout from the F-35 program, you look at their defense sales abroad, they're doing okay. And so you almost think that, by being pushed out of the F-35 program, they could no longer count those sales, projected sales of F-35 components. So therefore, they had to fill the gap, and necessity is the mother of invention, and they invented a way out of the conundrum.
Yeah. So another factor, of course, is they had wanted at least 100 of the F-35
Right.
fighter jets. And I've said before that in my view, with the way the Lira went, that they just weren't in a position to afford to have those F-35s. And if you want to have a good example of this sort of thing happening, just come to Canada. Yes, I mean, we're part of the F-35 program. We have invested money and we build parts for it. But we have waffled and continue to waffle on whether or not we will actually buy the F-35 platform. We instead, to prolong the life of our F-18s, purchased surplus F-18s from Australia, stripped them down to get the bits we needed, and we're trying to keep our F-18 fighter fleet going for how long, I don't know. And coming out of COVID, do we have the money for the F-35? We have a competition, but you know, I sometimes think that Turkey has plans to develop its own indigenous fighter with the help of the British. And I had thought to myself at one point that Canada should team up with Turkey and we can develop a fighter jet that we can both afford, because this is the situation we find ourselves in.
Right. I mean, one of the things you have to ask, was there any sense to 100 F-35s? I mean, you start looking at where are the threats, the military threats that Turkey is going to face? Where would they come from? And it's, as long as they were not the initiator of the conflict, they could rely on their NATO partners to help them in any conflict. Well, between the US and the UK getting all these wonderful 5th generation multi-role combat aircraft, did Turkey really need to invest huge sums in 100 F-35s? I mean, one could argue, okay, maybe 2 dozen, maybe even 3 dozen, 36 of these, you know, super enhanced aircraft, 5th generation. But 100, I mean, what was the purpose to that? And it's, you know, I think you're right. I think that they're starting to think about, okay, if we can't have the F-35, what can we do on our own, or with some foreign partners that would be sufficient for our needs, and actually looking at what are the needs that we have, rather than how do we make ourselves a big important member of this program.
Yeah, I think being part of the F-35 program, simply for many militaries, it's being able to match or be a part of what the US has to offer.
Yeah.
You're on the A team.
Right.
We had wanted 65 of them. That's probably what we will end up, 65 of something. Obviously, developing your own indigenous fighter is fraught with difficulties. It's expensive. It can be many issues along the way. And of course, Turkey has an aging F-16 fleet. So what do they actually do moving forward, right? And the F-35 it was a good option. But yes, I mean, the argument can always be, why do you need 100 F-35 fighters? Canada, for example, with our aging F-18s, provides quite often air defense coverage for example, Romania. We go in and out quite often to Romania, and that's collectively all the NATO partners working together. But what I think when it comes to Turkey, though, the mindset's a little different. Yes, Turkey wants to be a part of NATO. Yes, they will take NATO's support from time to time in the sense of the air defense systems that are deployed in the south and with AWACS and so forth. But an over-reliance on a bloc or one particular country is not in Turkey's DNA. I mean, we are talking about the former Ottoman Empire here,
right?
A country with tremendous influence for centuries in the region. And to imagine that Canadian, for example, fighter jets would be flying over Turkey, providing that country's air defense coverage because they can't, is just unimaginable.
Yeah.
So for Turkey, this is a matter of national pride that they have the best systems available. Whether or not they use them in combat ever, it's simply being able to have that option, and that's critical to
Yeah.
them. You know, it's easier for us over in Canada and even in the United States, but certainly in Canada, we don't have to worry about a quarter of what a country like Turkey has to worry about on any given day.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I understand that the Pentagon still has its plans to repulse the Canadian invasion of the United States. I think it was 1934 that was produced.
Yeah. Yes. That
so I'm
was
sure,
Plan B.
and I'm sure it's sitting on some shelf. But I mean, this is one of the great. It is. You're absolutely right. One of the great advantages the United States and Canada have is that, at least on our borders, the immigration crisis is an entirely different thing. That is not in any way like, an armed insurrection, an armed terrorist organization. I mean, Turkey, even if the PKK did not have a presence in Turkey, it's going to have a presence in Iraq just across the border. And
yeah, as it does.
It's very difficult to explain what that really is like to my fellow Americans. I mean, what it does to the psyche of Turks when they realize that within their country, and also just across the border, are well armed, well disciplined, active, military units. Call them insurgents, call them terrorists, call them both.
Yeah.
And it really is something that it's difficult for most of us to wrap our mind around.
There's two issues here, just to jump in really quickly on this. Obviously, in North America, we do have security concerns.
Sure.
We are considerably worried about the Arctic, and I know in Canada, our being able to safeguard our sovereignty in the Arctic is important, and not to have modern fighter jets with all the things that come with them is an issue for us, and we discuss this a lot. Also, then with the Kurdish issue, as you've been saying, I mean, the fact is, without some sort of reconciliation process happening within Turkey, this issue with the PKK isn't going away.
Right.
It's wishful thinking that without this, this problem will go away. And of course, we've seen things actually become far worse than they were even during the time that we were there. So that 2013, 2014 period when things were not looking too bad, and perhaps there might have been a way out of this, but since then it's going completely in the opposite direction.
Right.
So, what can be done to help Turkey with the reconciliation process? Well, again, this is an issue of national pride in Turkey, and outside influence and interference is not sought and not welcome. And so we will continue to talk about Turkey and these issues for years, decades.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sadly.
Well, it might be time for us to wrap up. I think we've been at this for about 45 minutes, which is longer than my bosses at Ahval News like, but that's all right. I think they will be understanding. I did want to return to this issue of Biden holding all the cards, but I think I understand what you're saying is that in this meeting with Erdoğan, his situation allowed him to let Erdoğan talk, to then let Erdoğan after the meeting, put out a press statement and get some kudos for all that. And certainly the whole issue about what happens to the lira if you come out with a lousy meeting. One thing we didn't discuss, but I did want to mention it. In the press conference following the Erdoğan-Biden meeting, which was delayed by at least an hour and a half from when it was hoped to take place. Erdoğan gave a separate press conference in which he said it was a fruitful meeting and good, and it was, blah, blah, blah. Biden came out to give his comments on the meeting, but he spent the first 5 minutes talking about how important it was for Americans to continue getting vaccinated against COVID.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought to myself, okay, master of deflection, don't really want to talk about the meeting I had with Erdoğan, because, so what am I going to use to deflect from that? We'll talk about COVID.
I'm sure that there weren't that many questions also
No.
coming from the audience.
The questions that Biden eventually got after he talked about COVID, but then he talked about G7, then he talked about NATO summit.
Mm-hmm.
No, the questions he got were either how forceful will NATO be? He got a really wacko question from some journalist about the Republican Party falling apart in the United States,
mm-hmm.
which was, it's one of those things, it's
mm-hmm.
out of bounds. I mean,
mm-hmm.
when you're overseas as the head of state of the United States or anywhere else, you don't talk about partisan politics
no.
in your home country. So why the reporter threw that question out, I don't know. But the real questions being asked, which is, I think he really prepared for, what's going to happen in the meeting with Putin. They were all kind of forward looking. They weren't, a little bit about, okay, is NATO standing up to China, this sort of stuff. So in some ways, coming out and talking about COVID first, I thought was a little masterful. I mean, it in a sense, it kind of cleared the decks. People moved on very quickly from talking about the G7 and NATO to Putin today. So
yeah, where many critical issues will be discussed.
Right.
But what I find just listening to some of the commentary around the whole Putin Biden meeting is that the tendency here in the Canadian press is to have a long list of all the things that Russia has done, and of course, if you're in Russia, the opposition is in trouble, and we don't like what we see, of course. But what I don't see in this whole discourse is the fact that if you're sitting in Moscow looking at the West, you've seen the West involved in Iraq since 2003, toppling the Libyan government, attempting to topple the Syrian government, and so on. And yet we're the ones shaking the fingers at them for grabbing Ukraine and being in Syria. In many ways, we set the conditions for these sorts of things to happen. And yet that discussion doesn't take place whatsoever. We've also, of course, seen NATO expansion, European Union expansion, and even our tiny Canadian Army has 500 of its best soldiers sitting in Latvia, commanding the battle group there. That side of the, how did we get to here is never really discussed. It's always just pointing the finger at the Russians as being the main issue. And heavens knows I wouldn't want to have Putin over for tea myself, but I raised this issue. I raised this issue because we seem to only ever talk about one side of this story.
Yeah, well, and Biden's predecessor got into a lot of trouble by saying not exactly the way you just said them, which is much more articulate than the way Trump said them, but he actually raised that issue. Why is it all the time that we pretend that the U.S. doesn't have any blame in the conflicts that occur? And he, of course, was excoriated for suggesting that there was some sort of moral equivalence between the United States and Russia, which is not what he was saying. But again, he's not a very articulate speaker. He doesn't do nuance well. But he, like you, was raising an important point, which is you can't really understand an adversary or opponent or enemy or competitor, whichever one of those terms you want to use, unless you learn how to see it from his perspective, not only your own. I mean, this goes all the way back to high school debate. I mean, debating teams in high school, one of the first lessons they're taught is, okay, you're on the other side. Make his best argument.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
until you can make the best argument from the other point of view, you are not going to be able to make a good argument against it from your point of view.
Yeah, I think also it points to being able to diffuse situations,
Right.
even though you found yourself in a bad situation because of decisions that have been made before. If you can come at it and say, look, I mean, we have a part to play in this as well, it can really help you try to diffuse situations. May not
Right.
succeed, but without doing so, then you just believe me, it just drives me crazy how commentators seem to gloss over or don't even talk about all the things that we have done, this trail of destruction, as an example, that we've left across the Middle East in the last 20 or so years.
Yeah.
And I'm
well,
not pointing my finger at the United States, because other countries, including Canada, have had a hand to play in this.
yeah. Well, we can talk about all the shared guilt for Libya, but that might take a couple more hours, and we really do have to wrap up. But yeah, no, it's a really good point. It's one that is not heard in the corridors of power in enough capitals around the world. It's incredibly easy to look at others, point a finger at them, and then wag your finger at them for their bad behavior, while ignoring, let's call them, at least we'll call them, missteps that one has made on one's own. Yeah,
for sure.
Okay, I'm going to hit the pause stop button, and maybe we can talk for a little bit, and then I look forward to seeing you. Maybe we can somewhere around, I don't know, July 15th.
There's always something to talk about, Ed. There's in that region with Turkey, there's always something to talk about. So.
Okay. Thanks again, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. Chris Kilford, retired from the Canadian Defence Forces, former Defence Attache in Turkey. And I hope you enjoyed this session, and we'll have Dr. Kilford back with us again. Take care. Bye.